Star Wars games that will be made in Unreal Engine 5 will have a much bigger impact than most fans will believe. The core reason to this is the two main components that will be coming with Unreal Engine 5, that being a new lighting engine called Lumen, as well as a whole new rendering engine called Nanite. Whilst the lighting engine Lumen will likely improve most games being built in Unreal Engine 5, it's Nanite that provides the biggest change for specifically Star Wars games. But why specifically Star Wars games? Well, the short answer to this is starfighters and spaceships used in space combat in most Star Wars games. Nanite at this moment in time cannot work on dynamic models that are mostly animated to stretch and squeeze to perceive movement. We see this most commonly in human characters, especially with hands that have so many joints that require so many specific movements. But objects like the Star Destroyer, the TIE Fighter, the X-Wing, these are all static models that don't change in any way until, well, they're destroyed. In most game development, the model swaps to a destroyed variant where you can see bits and pieces of the ship spread out in space. But just how powerful is Nanite in Unreal Engine 5? Well, we're actually going to show you some examples of how amazing Unreal Engine 5 is compared to Unreal Engine 4. We'll be showing you how ships look amazing in the new lighting engine, and how Nanite will allow developers to add in hyper-realistic, incredibly high detailed ships like the Star Destroyer. But before we dive into it, guys, if you're a fan of Star Wars like I am, why not join our Discord? We have tons of like-minded Star Wars fans like yourself. Not to mention, we just announced one of our biggest meme competitions yet, with just one winner winning a huge cash prize. So if you're interested to talk everything Star Wars Squadrons, Battlefront 2, Empire War with other people, and get involved in the EcksToo meme competition, the invite code to our Discord is in the pinned comment down below. But with that all said and done, let's dive right into the video. So just a heads up, originally we wanted to use some of FRACTALSPONGE's incredible models when it comes to Star Destroyers and the like. We weren't able to get his permission to use a more recent model that he's made, but he did publicly release an older model of an ISD a couple of years ago. So whilst this no longer represents FRACTALSPONGE's work that he can do now, it's still a very high quality model which has a much higher poly count than most Star Destroyers that we see in Star Wars games. Just by putting this model into Unreal Engine 5 and rotating the camera around to look at all the nooks and crannies of this ISD, and then compare it to an ISD in the most recent Star Wars game, Star Wars Squadrons, we could already see these two ships retain a pretty similar amount of detail, if not FRACTALSPONGE's having a bit more. Just don't be fooled by the lighting and the particle effects that you see in Star Wars Squadrons. They'll definitely be added in Unreal Engine 5 games as well. What's really notable is the detail in the back of the ship near the engine, with so many elements popping out from the main structure of the ship, giving it so much detail, especially in the back of the ship where most players won't be looking anyway. Whilst the Star Wars Squadrons model has a lot of detail as well, it relies a lot more on texturing and bump mapping to artificially add in that depth to make the 3D model look more 3D, I guess. It's a common technique used in Unreal Engine 4 and Frostbite and any other proprietary game engine. A good example of this is you wouldn't really want to make a 3D model of a brick wall. With all the bricks popping out and cement pushing in, it results in a lot of polygons, and a lot of game consoles don't have a lot of polygon resources. So you have to make sure all those polygons are being put to good use elsewhere. But with bump mapping, it gives this 3D lighted effect on 2D textures without really giving up too much of a cost on polygons. But that's not the only cost-effective measure game developers use when optimizing their game. Another is LOD, otherwise known as level of detail. This has been an age-old industry trick where objects lose detail the further away you are from them. This way, you can still see the object far away in the distance, but it hardly uses up any processing power because it ends up losing polygons the further away you go. This dates back all the way to Spyro the Dragon on PS1, which was one of the very first games to actually use LOD. And whilst it was very obvious, I mean, who hasn't played a game where you suddenly see a new texture pop up the closer you get to it? Current generation games have gotten very good at hiding the texture and polygon swaps when you get closer to an object. But in Unreal Engine 5, you don't have to do that, all because of Nanite. Don't believe me? Let's multiply this Star Destroyer by 100. 100 fully detailed Fractal Sponge Star Destroyers in one map, and when pulling out, they don't lose detail. But why is that, and why is it performing so well? Well, we'll answer the performing question a little bit later on in the video, but the reason we're not losing detail on these ships as we pull away is because Nanite intelligently bunches up polygons together in such a way where the model doesn't lose any detail. Think of it like levels of detail, LOD, but with some sort of AI intelligence. The system will do its very best in retaining the original object structure without giving up any cost to performance. We can actually see this in real time if we turn on the polygon view with Nanite. Every different colored triangle you see here represents a polygon. As you can see, there's countless numbers of them when you're up close to the Star Destroyer, but as we pull away, we can see the number of these colored polygons reduce in numbers. This is pretty much a perfect layman's term for Nanite, and it is as easy as clicking one button to activate it. Again, providing that your model is a static one, not a dynamic one, Nanite will work pretty darn well. But it isn't just models that get a massive update in Unreal Engine 5. It's also the lighting, as I mentioned earlier with Lumen. Here we can see our standard shadow maps on FRACTALSPONGE's ISD model. It's very flatlined and makes everything look a little bit embossed in a way. And looking at how these shadows work on rocks, yeah, it looks pretty good for a PS4 game, but it's very obvious that it isn't real, and it's mostly due to the direction of lighting not diffusing in the correct way. Take for example how light bounces off walls in Unreal Engine 4. Yeah, sure, it looks pretty good, but everything's quite dark and grey. The light isn't being influenced by the coloured walls whatsoever, so it just has this gradient of white to black. But in Unreal Engine 5 with Lumen, we can see the light being influenced by the colours of the walls and have it refract onto other walls alike, giving it a much more saturated, realistic look to how lighting works in the real world. So coming back to the Star Destroyer example, it finally helps us understand why this Star Destroyer and the rocks beneath it looks kind of odd. Not to mention we have fade-ins on some shadows the closer we get, using some sort of LOD effect because it's so intensive on processing power. But if we turn on Unreal Engine 5's new virtual shadow maps, we can see just how much better it looks. The direction of lighting is correct, shadows are being casted at the intensity they're supposed to be, and we finally remove this weird Photoshop emboss effect on the Star Destroyer. And not just that, the shadow LOD effect I mentioned earlier is completely gone, with all shadows being correctly casted as far as the eye can see. But just remember guys, these are just two settings we were able to turn on with pretty much a click of a button, and it already looks amazing. Imagine what professional Unreal Engine developers could do if they were given the time, resources and money to do so. I think one thing I'm looking forward to the most is really capturing that space look effect. It was very common in films like Interstellar and The Martian, but with the likes of Lumen and Nanite in Unreal Engine 5, I really think those effects are doable now in real time. So next, let's compare models from Star Wars Squadrons to FRACTALSPONGE's one. There's no doubt in my mind there was some sort of LOD effect being used on things like raiders, fighters, corvettes, etc. But in Unreal Engine 5, we can completely remove those and have none of our performance be affected in Unreal Engine 5. Here we can see the Imperial Raider and the CR-90, as well as a full selection of TIE interceptors, fighters, bombers, defenders, Y-wings, B-wings, the like. And they all look absolutely fantastic in these new lighting engines and renderers. Something like this is very doable in Blender, but to see it real time in Unreal Engine 5 is mind-boggling. And yes, while this Star Destroyer model is a bit dated, just imagine how fantastic FRACTALSPONGE's more recent models will look in Unreal Engine 5. If you take a look at his rendered images, he definitely captures that space look really well, and that could totally be done in real time in some way, shape or form in Unreal Engine 5. And this is mostly thanks to Nanite, and explains why we're going to see such a huge shift in performance and graphics for Star Wars games when being made in Unreal Engine 5 compared to 4. And finally, I mentioned earlier the 100 Star Destroyer test. Why did Unreal Engine 5 not even break a sweat having all of those models in view? Well, you probably already know the answer by now. Nanite crunches the numbers and reduces the polygons into a much more manageable number. It doesn't matter how many Star Destroyers you have on screen, as long as they're static models, Nanite will be able to crunch the numbers on every frame of every second, meaning that Nanite can analyze the polygons and reduce them down up to 60 to 120 times a second. And if you're really unsure just how impactful Nanite is from this, let's see a comparison without Nanite. Here we have 64 red Star Destroyers, all of them not using Nanite, and the engine is running at just about 30 something frames a second. That's a huge cost performance and is why we can't have so many of these detailed models on screen in console or PC games. And it gets worse. As we start moving the camera, the FPS dips all the way as low as 23 frames per second. But with Nanite and no optimization tricks utilized yet, we can see all these Star Destroyers working at about 92 frames per second, even when the camera is moving around. That is how powerful Nanite is, and that is how powerful Lumen is. And that is why Unreal Engine is going to change the future for Star Wars games, because there isn't really a franchise that comes to mind that will use this many static models, because a lot of combat in Star Wars tends to be with starships in space, something Nanite can really take advantage of. And that is pretty much a detailed look in what Unreal Engine 5 can do for Star Wars games. I did do another video of this kind a couple of months ago, and you can check it out in the top right corner in the info card right now. It doesn't go into this much detail, but it does give a few different examples that I didn't show in this video. So go and check it out, it's a pretty good video. And one more time, if you want to talk about this video and many other Star Wars games, be sure to join our Discord in the pinned comment down below. And why not get involved in the meme competition? If you've got good Photoshop or video editing skills, or you're a really talented illustrator, you probably have a very good chance of winning. So be sure to get involved. But with that all said and done, I've been Charlie, you've been watching EcksToo, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care, guys.